professor in the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center. And today we're very pleased through a co-sponsorship with the Global Sustainability Initiative here on campus to welcome my dear colleague, Ms. Angela Burnett. Angela is the Climate Change Officer for the British Virgin Islands and has written a book called The Irma Diaries, which you can purchase on Amazon or on her website, theirmadiaries.com. I was introduced to Angela a couple of years ago through a partnership that we have called the Sustainable Adaptive Gradients for the Coastal Environments, where a team of academics and practitioners are working together to develop coastal resilience solutions. Right here in our backyard in Maryland, in coastal communities up in the Northeast as well as in the Caribbean islands. And unfortunately, this past year, the British Virgin Islands was hit by a Category 5 hurricane, which you'll hear more about as Angela talks about what that did in terms of the communities. But I think the good news story that we'll hear today is not just about the devastation that happened and the resilience of the people within the British Virgin Islands, but also about the solutions and the opportunities for us right here in Maryland to be thinking about planning and creating a more resilient future for ourselves through climate change mitigation and adaptation policies. So with that, let's welcome Ms. Angela Burnett.
All right. Good day, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here at University of Maryland. This is my first time, but I understand that I got the colors right. My red, black, and gold. Pure coincidence. I was not given a heads up, I promise you. So I'm actually a graduate from Brandeis University, so I did my schooling over in the Northeast, Environmental Studies, Sustainable Development, and went on to do some graduate work in planning. So it's my extreme delight to come here today to share not only our experience, but as Melissa said, some of the lessons that we have learned. So I will be happy to entertain questions throughout the presentation if you have something burning, but at the end we'll also have an opportunity for question and answer. So I want to start by suggesting to you that we are all wrapped up in a new global war. I call it the climate Armageddon. And no country is immune. All of us will have to fight this war, whether you're a big country or a small island, whether you're developed or developing, it doesn't matter. Some of us are on the front lines, like I would say the Virgin Islands is, and we fight these battles regularly. So last summer, as Melissa said, not only did we get hit by Category 5 Hurricane Irma, but just literally a month before, we got what was our worst flood in our history, in the peak of our dry season. On August 7th, we received about a quarter of our annual rainfall in a single day. Irma came a month later. 2 days following that, we were threatened seriously by a Category 4 Hurricane Jose, which thankfully turned north at the very last minute. And 2 weeks after Irma, we were hit by another Category 5 Hurricane, Maria. And so you wake up after those series of events and you literally think to yourself, oh my God, I could actually become a climate refugee. And I have to say I have worked in climate change for the last 10 years now, and I would confess that I've always thought that terminology, climate refugee, was a bit extreme, until last summer. And I realized it's not a reality that's 100 years down the road, 50, 25, 10, even 5. It's a reality that is on our doorsteps right now. And it's not just small islands in the Caribbean. There are millions of potential climate refugees all across the world. Hurricanes are just one type of extreme that we all will have to face as a result of a changing climate. So in the words of Phyllis Woolard, I want to welcome you to one of these battles, Armageddon. And I want to give you a first-hand glimpse of what these battles result in. The sun woke me up today, lightly shining on my forehead, dancing on the contours of my face. Before, this would have bothered me, but today, After surviving Irma, I welcomed it as a reminder from God that He was still on our side. Irma's strike was relentless, merciless, and unforgiving. I will never forget her. I remember feeling extremely lucky that a blown-in window was the only damage my home had suffered. Most houses I passed were either completely destroyed, blown away like doll houses, or still standing but not habitable. Somewhere deep beneath all the gratitude I felt for having somewhere to go after I had enough of the miserable scenes all around me, I felt guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that having some place to sleep that night was some sort of illicit pleasure that I wasn't entitled to. So some quick facts on Hurricane Irma. It made a direct hit on the Virgin Islands on the 6th of September 2017. So I should just go back to this image very quickly. It's actually an infrared image taken of Irma at exactly 12:46 p.m. on that day. And the squiggly lines that you see within the well-defined eye of the hurricane, which is that blue ring, that is actually the Virgin Islands. So this storm was so big that literally the entire country, for the most part, fit right within the eye of this hurricane. Now, Irma packed 185 mile-per-hour winds, maximum sustained winds, which means that that was the average condition for about the 12 or so hours that this storm lasted. But there were regular gusts of over 200 miles per hour. Now, not a fact that you will hear often, but this actually made Hurricane Irma the strongest hurricane ever at time of landfall in the history of the Atlantic hurricane season. And you don't hear that fact repeated often because our islands are so small that when hurricanes hit us, they're not technically considered to be a landfall event. So what does a Category 5 do to a small island, or for that matter, anywhere that a Category 5 might hit? The answer is certainly catastrophic damage. So our governance and security systems were severely challenged in the wake of Irma. In fact, our main administration complex here, about 95% of the offices were destroyed. This forced government to have to literally relocate on the fly and figure out how to maintain operations in a country that had been entirely devastated. And of course, the population is looking to government to lead relief and recovery. Even the National Operations Center, which is housed separately and responsible for heading up that relief, that building was basically flattened during the first half of the storm. Security concerns literally led to us having a military-imposed curfew that lasted from the 7th of September, the day after the hurricane, until just about Christmas time. So that meant, I like to tell this joke, that I broke the law basically every night writing this book. As I did not have electricity at home, I found myself camped out at our local sewage treatment plant, which eventually had backup generation power. And my mother will tell you that I would come home every night around 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and I got stopped quite a few times by the military or local police with literally machine guns drawn, wanting to know where I was coming from. So I'm very thankful for my innocent-looking face that has saved me on more than one occasion. Right, so the economic impact. We are a tourism-based economy, and our secondary pillar is financial services. The economic impact to the tourism sector alone was estimated to be 2.5 times our entire GDP, and those were just initial estimates. The images that you're seeing are taken from our capital city, Road Town, so that just gives you a sense of the type of severe damage to local businesses and to important institutions like our banking institutions. Our critical infrastructure was not spared in the least. So the Virgin Islands was in complete blackout for about 5 days post-Irma. So what does that mean? Not even the electricity generation plant, the power plant, which is the green building on the top left, not even that plant had power. There was simply no electricity generation. We lost about 95% of our electricity distribution grid, which meant that it took about 2 months before the first communities were able to come online again. And it was 6 months plus before all communities were restored with electricity. February 25th is a day I never forget, because that's the day I finally got power again. And I have with me, I forgot to bring it up, the little inflatable solar-powered light that we would use in the home as our main source of lighting. Not having electricity meant that there was, for many communities, for many months, not portable running water, because 100% of that in the Virgin Islands is produced through desalination. As the images show, we had severe damages to our road systems, in particular our coastal roads, many of which were simply washed out. And many of our critical coastal facilities, you can't see this too well, but you're looking at one of our two main port facilities, which is of course, important gateways for our economy as we are tourism-based. Those buildings have just been entirely destroyed. Critical services also experienced severe blows. So people describe the aftermath of Irma very much like a bombing, and that is what it looks like. You're looking at, again, an image from the Capitol Road town. This is the campus of our main high school, of a student population of about 1,200 students. You can see concrete structures that have literally been flattened or roofs blown off. About 30% of the schools look something like this, which meant that a lot of students have actually had to migrate now to just even continue their education. Hospital services, thankfully, were okay, but a lot of the secondary clinics where people really go to for primary care were severely affected. So about 40% of those were severely damaged to the point that they were not usable. Housing, we like to say that we were all in this together. There was no household that was untouched. So over 90% of homes were damaged. About a third of them looked something like this, so either completely destroyed or missing a major section of roof. Our environment, again, not spared, and the impact was literally visible from space. So you're looking at a satellite image of the Virgin Islands before Hurricane Irma, and now after Hurricane Irma. Green hillsides to brown hillsides, literally in a matter of hours. If you looked up close, this is a typical hillside. There was not a leaf left on a tree. Impact to the coastal systems was also just as extreme. So I told you we're tourism-based. Our beaches are literally the engines of our economy. You're looking at the same beach, Bruce Bay, on the main island, before Hurricane Irma at the top right, and after Hurricane Irma on the left. Same beach vegetation just entirely wiped out. And that will take many, many years to be recovered. So it means that there are many tourism seasons down the road where this impact will be felt. Every single mangrove on our islands now looks like that. Mangroves are important not just for fisheries, but for our coastal defense, etc. And many of these trees are dead because their tops have been broken off, which means that they won't regrow, and we're looking at a new generation of mangroves coming in 15 to 20 years before they are mature trees. So I've shared with you sort of the country level experience, but can you imagine just the human experience actually going through this event? So I want to share with you just a few stories, and I'll take you back to the map to orient you a bit. Let's go back. This first one is from the island of Anegada, which was actually not in the thick of things. So Anegada is our sort of northernmost island. I don't think I have a pointer, but if you look just at the upper right outside of the red band, you see a little island outlined there. That's Anegada. So it wasn't hit by the eye of the hurricane, it sort of just got the outer bands. So I'll share this experience, but keep in mind that this was not the most extreme, and there's a video that goes along with it. Let's just get us back to the right place. Right, so this story is called Body Bag. It's a fisherman from the island of Anegada, and he has lost his entire home. His home disintegrates around him during the first half of the hurricane. And I'm sorry that this video somehow is a bit twisted, but as if to flaunt her power still, before I could turn the knob and push the front door open, Irma caused the entire front wall of my house to fall on its face, stringing a crisscross of electrical wires immediately in front of me. My instincts now were my only survivor kit. Observing again the direction of the winds, I scrambled to the side of my fishing boat, Big Kid, where I sheltered for the next few hours. From there, I played student in Irma's short course in demolition, taught by her experienced instructors, with the remainder of my house sacrificed as the demonstration piece. Thankfully, Irma discarded the roof somewhere far beyond where I could see, and the 4 walls fell in whole pieces, saving me the additional horror of strips of galvanized and wood attacking me. It was Irma and me out there alone. I got to know her well, her unforgiving, strong winds that coated the air white, her bullet-like torrents of rain, her wild temper and propensity for regular outbursts, in which she would pick up and hurl anything, her apparent disdain for trees, and her eagerness to strip them bare or pluck them straight out of the ground, just as easily as one might pluck a flower. So that's body bag, and I think in the video you can actually see some of what is being described, the air sort of being just white from the combination of strong winds and rain. And finally, I'll share with you from the story Gunpoint. Very different setting. This is now on the hillsides of the main island of Tortola. And 4 generations, primarily women, were sheltering in this home. It was a 2-story block structure. It literally all disappeared in a flash, and they were sheltering in the safe room that they had prepared, which was on the bottom floor at the extreme rear of the building at the back. The interior walls are sheetrock. The 2 doors there are the doors that are being spoken of here. So the ladies were literally up against those doors, which is now facing the brunt of the storm because everything else around it has disappeared. Not satisfied with the havoc she wreaked in every other room in the house, Irma wrestled ruthlessly to get into our safe room. I could feel the interior sheetrock wall of the room vibrating violently. I remember standing in fear that the wall would fall in and crush us. I looked across at Chelsea, and she was shaking like a leaf. Somehow, she said, I managed to appear calm. I think she best describes how we all felt in that moment. That level of fear is equivalent to being held at gunpoint. So you just get a sense of what it's actually like to go through this experience. So what's the outlook? Unfortunately, it is not pretty. Irma was definitely not only an event of our past, but in many real ways a glimpse of our future. So the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has given us an outlook that we will have stronger hurricanes more frequently as a result of climate change. In fact, the data already shows that over the satellite era, which was from 1979 forward, we have already seen an increase in the strongest storms in the North Atlantic. And projections show that over the century, this will continue to be the case. In fact, I like to read this directly, the last bullet. It is more likely than not that the frequency of the most intense storms will increase substantially in some basins, including the North Atlantic. And I read that language directly because if you've ever read an IPCC report, like I've had to read many, they use extremely conservative language. So terms like more likely than not and increase substantially just speak to the level of high confidence that they have in these projections. Since Hurricane Irma, I've had the privilege of getting to know Professor Kerry Emanuel. He is an atmospheric scientist at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, and he studies the physics of hurricanes. He heads up their Lorenz Center, which is dedicated to studying the science of climate change, and they have done some very interesting probability work. In particular, they have looked at the probability of encountering a hurricane of Irma's magnitude within a certain proximity to the Virgin Islands. Now, when I was a little girl in 1990, that probability was just 1 in 800 in any given year. In my short lifetime, and I'm not afraid to say my age, I'm only 32 years old, that probability has increased exponentially to 1 in 180 in any given year. And if we don't do something to curb our greenhouse gas emissions to really control how much we're changing our climate, they estimate that that probability will increase further to 1 in 60 in any particular year. So these type of what are today extreme, unlikely storms are more and more becoming our new norm. And as somebody who lives in a hurricane-prone region, this scares the heck out of me, but it should scare the heck out of anybody, because hurricanes are just one example. They're just exhibit A of the type of extreme events that we will experience as a result of climate change. Like I said, it's a global war. There will be different expressions in different places. Some places, extreme drought, extreme flooding, extreme high tides, longer-term sea level rise, more frequent severe nor'easters, wildfires, all of these extremes. So climate change, like I said, is driving all of this. And climate change is essentially a change in our climate above and beyond the natural variability that exists in the climate system, and a change that is really being driven by human activity that is either directly or indirectly changing the composition of our atmosphere. And there is absolutely no denying it. The data is very clear that the climate system is warming. It has been warming. Both the atmosphere and the ocean have warmed. We have seen the amounts of sea, ice, and ice sheets decline, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, have increased. So just quickly to show you some of this data, we're looking at the ocean and air temperature anomalies, so basically changes either above or below the average from 1880 almost through to present day. So anything in blue represents below average temperatures, and these are global averages. Anything in red represents above average. And you can see from about 1950 or so, there has really been a change in things. So we are seeing consistently now, not just an increase above the average, but it's getting worse and worse every year, increasingly warmer temperatures above our global averages. And I just want to show you quickly that the data points to a very, very clear correlation over a very long time period. So this dates back to 800,000 years ago, and this data comes from things like ice cores and sediment cores, from which we can deduce concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over long periods of time, as well as the temperature of the Earth. And you can see they rise and fall together. And we know that there's not just a correlation, but a very clear cause-effect relationship. As we increase carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, because chemically it is a gas that traps heat, we are increasing the temperature of the Earth. So we're really living in unprecedented times. I like to say that as human beings, we are busy creating a climate for ourselves that human civilization has really never existed in before. So in the Caribbean, we are trying to adapt to this new climate future. I just want to highlight two agencies that are working feverishly on this. So there's the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, that heads up and spearheads a lot of adaptation efforts across the Caribbean. And we also have the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States that does similar work. So some of the examples of things that we're doing: strengthening building codes. There's a 2015 revised OECS regional building code that really uses climate changes as a foundation for how we're going to be designing buildings in the future. So designing for more frequent flooding, for warmer temperatures, for stronger hurricane events, for sea level rise. And that code is actually being revised further as a result of what happened last hurricane season. Events like Hurricane Irma and Maria. We're now revising that code to reflect Category 5 plus hurricanes. And we're also trying to implement better planning and enhanced protections of our environment. So really trying to plan our communities with the factors of climate change being the basis of our planning. And then we have actually some physical adaptation projects that are happening on the ground to try to reduce impacts to communities. So I'll just share two examples of those projects locally. I talked about the 2017 flood. We had just about a month before that flood hit implemented a pilot adaptation project to try to reduce flood risk in communities. We are traditionally a very dry climate, so floods are not historically a part of our experience. But we're seeing now, since 2003, a number of very regular flood events. So we've tried to implement enhanced drainage to try to deal with this. So you're looking at the same hillside during both of these flood events. 2003, here you're looking downhill. 2017, you're looking uphill. 2017, we actually had more rain than the 2003 event, but look at the difference during the experience as a result of the simple drainage solution. So there are some solutions that can be implemented that will make big differences. But of course, these solutions are expensive. Here's an example of a coastal defense system that was implemented just at the end of June last year, so again about 2 months before Hurricane Irma. And this became critical in terms of actually saving the road link that goes to one of our main tourism communities, King Garden Bay. So it looks like it might just be a random set of boulders strewn along the coastline, but a lot of engineering went into this. We actually had to do a coastal dynamics study of this bay to get an understanding of the wave patterns and the wave energy that would occur in the bay during different strength or category storms. Then this structure was designed based on that to withstand a category 4 storm surge. So it actually has a very particular slope, a particular width to the crest, and the boulders that have been used are of a specific density, mass, and size. So it looks very simple, but a lot went behind this. And I'm actually very pleased to say that this structure withstood the 25-foot storm surge associated with Category 5 Irma, which it wasn't designed for, quite well. It just got littered with some debris, but besides that, the structure was intact, and it did the function of protecting the road behind it. Now, just next door in neighboring Carrot Bay, a very different reality. So we did not have one of those revetment projects in place there, just an older, more traditional seawall. And the result of that was that that house, which looks charred, literally caught a fire during Hurricane Irma as a result of the storm surge interfering with the vehicles in the yard, which caused an electrical fire of sorts that caught onto the house. So the realities can, play out quite differently when we have these measures in place or not. The other thing that we're working very hard on is a sustainable financing mechanism. As we are an overseas territory of the United Kingdom, we find ourselves in a very peculiar situation. So we are literally shut out of any of the financing instruments that are available through the United Nations Climate Change Framework, the UNFCCC. So, for instance, the Green Climate Fund, which is the main pot of money available internationally to small islands to help us adapt to climate change, is not a pot that we can access. At the same time, the UK has not implemented any long-term systematic or programmatic support to help us adapt to climate change and also mitigate our carbon emissions. So we're sort of out on our own, and the solution that we've come up with to address this is we've just put in place our independent climate change trust fund. This has been established by law, and it's actually going to be accredited through the Green Climate Fund. So we're going through now putting in place all of the institutional frameworks to ensure that it achieves that accreditation, which means that it will meet the highest levels of transparency and fiduciary management, etc. And the goal is to really solicit bilateral donations to the fund, as well as contributions from individuals or independently wealthy persons or philanthropic groups to put resources in the fund to help us to continue to implement the types of adaptation projects I just mentioned across all sectors that will be impacted. So there are some important lessons that we learned from Hurricane Irma, both in terms of just preparation for these type of events and response, as well as longer term adaptation lessons. And I just want to share those with you. So you all may have seen the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. It basically tries to depict the level of impact associated with the various category hurricanes from 1 right through 5, and it tells you the associated wind speeds as well. Now, you might look at this, as many people did, and figure that there is some linearity between a Cat 4 and a Cat 5, right? They're just one apart from each other in terms of wind speeds, and then they both are described as having catastrophic damage. Now, having gone through both a very strong Category 4 hurricane in 1989, Hurricane Hugo, and coming out of that relatively unscathed, and then going through Category 5 Hurricane Irma in 2017, the Virgin Islands can tell the world in no uncertain terms that in reality, there is absolutely no linearity between a Category 4 and a Category 5 hurricane impact. It is just night and day, exponential. In fact, one of the persons I interviewed in writing the Irma Diaries happened to be the person who headed up the recovery to Hurricane Hugo in '89. And she said that she would rate the impact of Hugo at only 25% that of Hurricane Irma. And of course, Hugo was almost 30 years ago when, things would not have been as advanced as they are today. So exponential, in fact, I think we need to advocate for this scale being revised to not only depict the impacts differently, but to even maybe in the face of a change in climate, start talking about a Category 6, a Category 7, as we've been saying locally. This is no longer relevant for our change in climate. So just to show you some of what I'm talking about when I say the impacts are exponential. In Hurricane Hugo, it took less than 2 weeks for electricity to be fully restored. In Irma, more than 6 months. Tourism sector damages from Hugo were just $15 million. In Irma, $2.8 billion. And yes, there's been passage of time and factors like inflation, but nothing to account for these extreme, drastic differences. The other thing I've learned is the importance of how we communicate risk. So most people, I think, they know that term catastrophic damage, and you have a theoretical understanding of what that means, but you don't have any clue as to what that means in practice or in reality until it happens to you. And that was the experience of Nancy, one of the people I interviewed for the Irma Diaries. She recalls how she looked up the wind speed and the expected impact from Irma. She saw that term catastrophic damage. She's highly educated, experienced, but just sort of went, what does that actually mean? And then reflected on how she knew very firsthand what that meant after Hurricane Irma. That was literally the only wall that was left standing of her home. So just how we communicate risk to people and understanding some of the major challenges that you face in a situation where you have experienced catastrophic damage. Lack of communication, lack of transportation systems, lack of basic services, electricity, water. You're dealing with a debris crisis, and just the logistics of having to try to coordinate relief efforts. The other interesting fact that I learned is information about the storm is only a small factor in what drives decision making. So it was interesting to me how the people that I interviewed all had received basically the same information about Hurricane Irma, but people received that information very differently, they interpreted it differently, and as a result they made very different preparation decisions. And a lot of it was just based on life circumstances at the time, sort of belief systems, capacity, resources, as opposed to actual information about the storm. So 3 things that popped up a lot. One, we had just had that major flood event, and there were a lot of people who were just sort of thinking, believing in the law of natural justice, that there's no such thing as double jeopardy. We just had a flood, we're not going to have a major hurricane. I'm not able to deal with another disaster right now, so it's not going to happen. Then a lot of people bought into this historical luck. So the Virgin Islands has been missed several times at the last minute, just like Jose did, by major hurricanes. And most people, well, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of people had this mentality like, oh, we're just going to get missed again. They always miss us. And so did not prepare for Irma actually hitting us. In fact, it was projected to go a little bit north. Then there were some people like George, who I find just to be a hilarious character, who was so busy, so wrapped up helping everybody else that George didn't know it was a Category 5 hurricane until after the hurricane had hit. So just very different levels of awareness and preparation. And of course the fact that everybody thought we're going to be fine because we had gone through Hugo, we had experienced the worst of the worst, and this can't be much worse than that. Well, we were all very wrong. The other thing is the importance of really integrating local knowledge in how we communicate risk. So the island of Anegada, flat as a pancake, want to evacuate because 25-foot storm surge is going to occur, the island will be washed over. Some people, like the fisherman I read from in Body Bag, refused to leave the island, insisting that the horseshoe reef, which you can see the evidence of all along the shoreline, would protect Anegada. Turns out he was right. Anegada was not washed over by even a 25-foot storm surge, and the island actually fared best in Hurricane Irma. And so not integrating those type of factors into the messaging to people really serves ultimately to reduce the confidence and to reduce the trust in the agencies delivering the messages. And the second lesson in that is really the importance and the value of natural systems like our coral reefs, which are under severe threat by the same climate change in protecting our coastlines. So we've always known in theory that coral reefs can reduce storm surge by about 70%. Well, the experience of Anegada and Hurricane Irma proves that very directly. And some important adaptation lessons that we learned. So one, climate change really requires us to prepare for the unprecedented. We need to understand that we're no longer dealing with the same type of extreme events that we grew up with or that our parents and our grandparents experienced. We're dealing with new types of extremes, and maybe extremes that we can't even imagine. And somehow we need to find a way to imagine these new extremes and actually plan for them. And we need to come up with continuity plans, for example, for government, that really imagines these unimaginable scenarios. So if I had sat in a planning meeting in the months leading up to Irma and had told my colleagues, listen, that's the list of impacts that we need to prepare for, people would have thought that I was crazy, right? And sort of shooed me to the side and said, no, that's never going to happen. But this was the reality on the ground on the 6th of September. And even though we have very good disaster management systems, nobody was prepared for this because it was simply unprecedented and unimaginable. And then I want to say that and stress that we have to use the opportunity of the recovery period to simultaneously build resilience. If we're not doing that, it means that we're not adapting. We're not preparing for this new future. Irma is not, unfortunately, going to be the last of these events that we see. I've shown you the probabilities. So how do we do this? Since Irma, I've really been thinking of this concept that I think the terminology blue skies planning really fits well. So what I mean by that is planning for the adaptation, planning for the change that you want to see before the disaster strikes. Because disasters provide sort of the most opportune time for us to implement sometimes the drastic measures, drastic changes that we need to implement in order to adapt to climate change. But they're also the most difficult times for us to implement change because you're dealing in a disaster environment. People have lost everything, and people simply want to recover in the fastest, quickest, easiest way possible. And sometimes that path of least resistance is not the path to adaptation. And so the only way that we're going to achieve these changes is if we plan for them in detail, and not just plan for them, but plan how we're going to roll them out, how we're going to implement them in a disaster environment before the disaster hits. So just 3 quick examples. We were out of power for, in some cases, up to 6 months. We had lost 95% of our grid. We actually have a policy that says we want to achieve 20% renewable energy on our grid by 2020. What a perfect opportunity, right? We've already lost the grid. People don't have power. People are desperate. They're willing to try anything to have power. We could have used that opportunity to implement rooftop solar all across the islands, right? For people that did have their house roof still. But it was a missed opportunity at the time, not because it's not something that we want to do, but because we never sat down and said, okay, what if a Cat 5 rolls through and we lose our grid to this extent? How can we utilize this opportunity when we have assistance pouring in from all over the world? Instead of utilizing that assistance to try to rebuild our grid in 6 months, let's see if we can utilize that assistance to have a massive conversion over to renewable energy and rebuild a smart grid. So again, planning for the adaptation implementation in a disaster environment, because in a disaster mode, it is no time for planning. It is only time for implementing a plan you already have in place. A second good example would be implementation of coastal retreat strategies. So we've known for a long time that we need to retreat our infrastructure along the coastlines, but on a regular day, it's very difficult to go to anybody and say, oh, excuse me, please, can you move your $1 million building back just a few hundred meters? It would be wise for sea level rise, which is going to start to affect you in 25 years down the road, or when the next major storm surge rolls through. But if you've already had a hurricane wipe out those structures for you and people are rebuilding from scratch, it's the perfect opportunity to have those structures built 100, 200 meters back, right? In an entirely new setting, in a planned way, so you're able to maintain the links to the beaches that allows you to still have the same type of economic activity. But that type of retreat takes time. It takes planning a whole new community. It takes working out complex land issues, access issues, financing issues. And those planning periods can last maybe up to 2 years or so. So again, after the disaster, there's no time to sit down for 2 years and figure out how you're going to do this, because people need to recover their livelihoods. So in advance, if we had planned how we're going to retreat, for example, King Garden Bay, maybe we could have utilized the nearby Crown lands, for instance, to retreat those commercial entities to that location and still have the vibrant King Garden Bay that it is, but a more resilient King Garden Bay. Finally, I want to conclude with just a few thoughts. One, there is a limit to how much we can adapt. We cannot engineer our way out of this crisis. It means then that we have to mitigate. The world has to get serious about cutting carbon emissions. And we are way beyond the breaking point. So 350 parts per million is widely recognized as sort of the upper safe limit of carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere. We are way past this. We are now over 400 parts per million concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which is simply unprecedented. I was at a panel discussion at Columbia University about a week ago in New York, and one of the experts on the panel said some very scary facts, including that in their estimation we have maybe just 10 to 15 years to get our emissions right. So we are running out of time to address this challenge. So there's so many things that you can do. I'll just go through these quickly. One is reducing your own carbon footprint. And there are many ways to do this, including simple low-cost fixes like utilizing public transportation more often, not wasting energy in your homes, turning off the light, turning off the TV when you're not watching it, keeping the temperature just a few degrees cooler or warmer depending on which season you're in. And those things have huge impacts. If you think that they don't make a difference, I read a study recently that shows that if people took these personal actions, that collectively it could make up or account for as much as 15% of the nation's total carbon dioxide emissions. And that's huge. And these are simple little changes that everybody can make in their own lives. You can also become a climate advocate. There's so many groups right here in the US that people can become involved in to really shout for this cause, which for many people it's kind of latent, it's on the back burner, it's not an issue that people are urgently paying attention to, and we need to bring it to the forefront. You can be a citizen scientist for climate change, observe changes that are happening right in your backyard over time and write about them, talk about them. Oftentimes people will trust their neighbor or their friend or their colleague more than they actually would, a scientist by training. So that can be something important. And then the last message in terms of what you can do, which I've come to realize is really critical. To me, it's the crux of the whole thing. We have to bridge personal connections to climate change. So there's a simple reality, which is that human beings, we don't act on things that we don't care about. And we simply don't care about things that we don't have some sort of personal connection to. And for a long time, I thought that if people just understood the science, they would act. But it's not the case. We need to bridge these personal connections. I literally remember walking out of my first class on climate change as an undergraduate and thinking, oh, melting ice caps, polar bears, I'm a Caribbean girl, doesn't have that much to do with me. It's so easy to feel disconnected from this issue, for it to feel 100 years down the road. It feels vague, it feels abstract, it feels distant, it feels like something that's not happening now and not hurting anybody. And I really feel like the communication on climate change has been wrong. Polar bears, melting ice caps, maybe coral reefs have become the face of climate change. People see it as strictly an environmental issue and something down the road. And so we really need to turn that on its head. We urgently need to make climate change a human issue, and we need to link it to our very survival. And until we do that, people will not pay it the kind of attention that it needs. People will not feel connected, people will not care, and people will not act. And I think one of the best ways, and turns out that lots of literature supports this idea as well, one of the best ways to do that is to actually share personal human stories from the front lines of climate change. And these battles are being fought everywhere. It's not just the hurricanes of 2017, but they're certainly an excellent showpiece of the impacts of climate change. So I would encourage you to read these stories yourselves and to share them with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues. Share them to the world through your social media. Like Melissa said, the book is available. The book is available through my website, which is theirmadiaries.com, and it's also available through Amazon. And I want to just leave you with a quick story as some evidence of the power of this connection building. So this young man is Shaquem Freeman. He's a typical 25-year-old. He's actually the first person that I interviewed for the Irma Diaries. And Shaquem showed up to the interview riding his motorcycle. He introduced himself by his nickname, Shooter. I'm not sure what that means. And he told me that, he's an aspiring musician and he spends his spare time clubbing. So Shaquem and I had a truly beautiful interaction. When he came to the interview, he knew very little, if anything, about climate change. And as a dutiful climate change officer, I took the opportunity to quickly tell him, how climate change was related to Hurricane Irma and his near-death experience. He literally could have died in this hurricane from the serious head injury that he had received. So we went through the interview about an hour long, and he tells me about his experience in great detail. And, I figured that would be it. But before he left, he had one very important question for me. Shaquem wanted to know how he could make a personal donation to our Climate Change Trust Fund, where I had explained to him that I would be donating 25% of the profits from this book. And that is still a very powerful and motivating experience for me, because it demonstrates very clearly just the power of a personal connection to climate change. It didn't take explaining to him any of the science or him understanding even, all of the nuances around climate change, just the power of a personal connection, and he was ready to act in some simple way that he could. So I want to leave you with that, and I'm happy to welcome any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you so much. So I don't know if there's a mic around, but it's a very audible room, so I think you can just shout out loud if you have any questions. Sure, yes.
I was curious, when you guys made the rock seawall protection, why you decided to build it for a Category 4 and not for a Category 5? Was it cost was the main barrier there? Or?
Right, so yes, cost was a factor in the equation for sure. In fact, we wanted to implement a much longer system because much of the road is still very much exposed and needs it, but because of the funding constraints, we could not. And really also because there's always a cost factor in these type of designs, not just because of what we had available to us, but you normally, I guess, design for the type of event that you expect to happen more frequently. And so Cat 5 was sort of the design standard, I guess. And nobody really expected, I think, a Category 5 and one as strong as Irma. And then, 2 weeks later, you get Maria. So I think there's a whole new thinking in the Caribbean now about these Category 5s and the fact that, hey, they're here, they're at our doorstep. This is the new future. But like I said, even though it was designed for a Category 4, it showed itself quite capable of withstanding a Category 5. But yes, cost implications and also just, I guess, the expectation of the type of event that you would, more commonly experience. Thank you for that. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
I had a question about the survival experience survival rate of the people based on their economics. You said 90% of the housing was destroyed, so clearly it really didn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you pretty much got wiped out. But how about for the people that sustained injuries? Was there a difference in the economic level? Was that significant?
Right. So very interesting question. Interestingly, very interestingly and miraculously, I would say, even though the damage, the devastation was so widespread, the death toll was literally 4. 4 people died in Hurricane Irma. I think 100 plus were injured and maybe injured seriously. I don't know that we have access to the data that would allow me to answer your question in terms of, whether there was some difference by, related to economic potential. But what I would say to you is that just from observation, some of the biggest mansions, sort of, the homes that you think were most strongly built and the fanciest homes that may have even had a lot more glass, which made them actually more vulnerable, were some of the homes where you saw more damage. But there seemed to be really no rhyme or reason to things. So one of the ladies that I interviewed who received a very serious head injury, she lived in what I would describe a concrete bunker. She had concrete walls, she had windows that were barricaded with hurricane shutters, she had a solid aluminum front door. And she still found herself thrown outside of her home, literally hanging off of her balcony with a gash to the back of her head. So a lot of this was just sort of, hit or miss, lucky or unlucky. I don't think there was so much a big tie to economics. What I would point out is that a lot of people found themselves in a position of vulnerability in that they're tenants, so they could not control the preparation over, the unit where they were housing during the hurricane. So there was a lot of that. A lot of the population in the Virgin Islands is immigrant, about 60% or so, and most of that population lives in apartments. And I would say that there was quite a lot of irresponsibility on the part of landlords, where many of them did not take measures to secure their properties. And so a lot of people were just sort of caught in that, I don't have anywhere to go, I'm stuck here, and I don't control how well this property is protected. And a lot of those people would be people who might not have been of the same economic, power as people who might be homeowners. So I would say that's where the disparity came in terms of the exposure, the vulnerability, but thankfully that was not expressed in a high death toll or, as much injuries as you might have expected. Sure.
So it's going to take time for the environment to recover naturally.
Yes.
So is it possible to take trees from other islands or other places, or mangroves from other places, and put them?
Yes, definitely, and this is exactly what we're trying to do, actually. It's a very good question, thank you for that. We've been gifted, for example, from the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, another neighboring Caribbean island, hundreds of beach vegetation, typical beach vegetation trees. So sea grapes, I think coconut trees, and some other species to help us, yes, repopulate our beaches with vegetation, and also fruit trees to help our farmers recover. But the reforestation effort that is needed is massive. So it's going to take more than just that present gift that we've been given. And even if we had, everybody pouring in those type of gifts, I think the real problem is the time scale, the time factor involved, because it will take about 10, if we're lucky, 15 years for these systems to, mature and really provide the values that they did before in terms of, shading on the beach, or just the aesthetic value that they provide to beaches, or coastal defense in the case of mangroves. And within that window, the likelihood of getting hit by another hurricane, even if it's not a Category 5, there's a high likelihood of that. So it's just sort of the probability of getting into this vicious cycle where you're constantly in a recovery type mode and not able to fully recover and have some breathing room before you're, wiped out again. But yes, to answer your question, and hopefully those systems recover before our next big one comes through.
What's the projection for the recovery of your tourism sector? And are there portions of the island that were maybe not hit as much that, I mean, it looked total, but that you could start to seed and have that and kind of have
Right.
that going and growing?
Sure. So the numbers that I saw initially were about, again, all of these numbers sound really extreme, but over 90% of tourism properties affected. We do have a number of properties, primarily I would say maybe the larger properties that are coming back online. The estimates that I've seen is maybe towards the end of this year where we might see the majority of them reopening. But there is some activity starting to take place. I think what we've seen is the cruise sector sort of being the quickest to recover. Unfortunately, it's not the sector that brings a whole lot of revenue. In fact, if you compare the cruise sector to the accommodation sector and the yachting subsector, it really is a trickle of economic activity compared to the others, but it's able to bounce back more quickly because it doesn't depend on as much, infrastructure as the other sectors do. So we're starting to see recovery, but I would say to you that it will likely be several years, several tourism seasons before we see a full recovery.
Well, Angela, thank you again so
Yes.
much, and
Thanks,
I would
Melissa.
encourage any of you all that want to read more about the survivor stories to purchase Angela's book on Amazon or a print copy on theirmadiaries.com. And join me in thanking her one more time.
Thank you. You have been a very good audience. Thank you so much.